A war over land begins. I never expected to come home to a battlefield. After a long, exhausting business trip, all I wanted was to take a deep breath of fresh air, kick my boots off, and relax. But as I pulled into my driveway, something was off. The first thing I noticed was that my property felt smaller. At first, I thought it was just fatigue messing with my head. But no, the land looked wrong. And then it hit me. My fence was gone. The fence that had always separated my property from the HOA-controlled neighborhood next door had vanished. In its place, a pristine garden that stretched deep into my land, filled with expensive flowers, stone paths, and a ridiculous bird bath that gleamed under the sun. It wasn't just a few inches of encroachment. It was an entire expansion, as if my land had been quietly absorbed into the neighboring homes, like some kind of suburban land grab. And standing in the middle of it, admiring her new empire, was Karen. Now, I don't like to throw the term Karen around lightly, but if ever there was a living embodiment of the word, it was this woman. Perfectly styled blonde hair, a tight pastel sweater despite the heat, and a smugness that could make angels weep. She held a clipboard, smiling at a couple of HOA board members, giving instructions as if she was a general overseeing a conquest. I gritted my teeth, about to march over and demand an explanation. But then I noticed something else. A dozen goats were running wild through the new garden, chewing on every bush, vine, and overpriced tulip they could get their mouths on. And oh, they were loving it. The goats unleash havoc. Now, I should mention that I own a small farm-style property on the outskirts of the HOA's rigid suburban grid. My land is large enough to house my little herd of goats, which I keep mostly as a hobby and for milk production. They're relatively well-behaved, provided they have their designated space. That space, of course, had been removed when Karen decided to demolish my fence. And since my goats had no idea they had been unceremoniously evicted from their area, they had simply wandered forward, straight into her new floral paradise. Tulips, delicious. Roses, scrumptious. Imported Japanese maple saplings. They never stood a chance. I stood in stunned silence as the chaos unfolded. One of my larger goats, affectionately named Tank, was chewing on the petals of what I could only assume was a ridiculously expensive ornamental shrub. Another, a small brown troublemaker named Muffin, had knocked over an entire decorative trellis, sending vines cascading onto the ground. A few others were munching away at a hedge maze, their expressions blissfully unaware that they were committing a crime against high society. Karen screamed. She dropped her clipboard, bolting toward the herd like a madwoman, arms flailing. No, no, and oh no, get away from there, she shrieked, trying to shoo my goats away. But anyone who knows goats understands one simple fact. Goats do not care. The more she panicked, the more they enjoyed themselves. I couldn't help but lean against my truck, arms crossed, and admire the poetic justice of it all. Here she was, basking in her grand landscaping scheme, only to have it immediately ravaged by the very creatures she had unknowingly set free. It was beautiful. Finally, she noticed me. Her wide, furious eyes locked onto mine. Her face was red with rage, her gardening gloves covered in dirt, her blonde hair frizzing at the edges. "What is the meaning of this?" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my beloved animals. I raised an eyebrow. "You tell me," I said, gesturing at the ruins of her once perfect garden. Her jaw dropped open like a fish gasping for air. Your disgusting little beasts are destroying my yard." "Your yard," I echoed, pretending to be confused. "That's funny, because last time I checked, this was my land." Her expression twisted in an instant. "Excuse me. This area was unused space. It was wasted. The HOA had every right to reclaim it for beautification purposes. You should be thanking me." I let out a low chuckle. "So let me get this straight. You stole my land, ripped down my fence, planted all this nonsense, and now you're mad that my goats are eating your hard work." She opened and closed her mouth again, struggling to form a coherent response. "They are ruining everything. You need to control your animals." I shrugged. "I did, until you decided their home wasn't theirs anymore." At that moment, Tank, my most mischievous goat, decided to hop onto Karen's expensive stone fountain, sending it toppling onto its side. The sound of shattering marble echoed across the yard. Karen screamed. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Karen's meltdown begins. "This is absurd," she bellowed, pointing at me like I had personally commanded the goats to commit an act of eco-terrorism. "I'm calling the HOA board, and you're going to pay for this destruction." I tilted my head. "Oh, please do," I said. "I'd love to hear their explanation for why they think they can steal my land and then complain when my animals do what they've always done." She fumed. "You're being unreasonable," she seethed. "This was for the good of the neighborhood." "The good of the neighborhood," I repeated, laughing. "Lady, you turned my backyard into a country club for squirrels, and now you're shocked that the actual residents of the space are using it." By now, the entire neighborhood was beginning to notice the spectacle. People peeked out of windows. A few stepped onto their porches, watching in amusement and mild horror as Karen stomped her foot like a child throwing a tantrum. Then, in her infinite wisdom, she decided that physically removing a goat was the best course of action. She lunged at one of them, a black and white troublemaker named Oreo, grabbing at his sides as if she could physically lift a fully grown goat off the ground. Bad idea. Oreo, not a fan of being grabbed, headbutted her right in the stomach. Karen let out a wheezy gasp before stumbling back, falling flat on her butt in the middle of her ruined garden. A collective gasp came from the nearby spectators. I nearly choked from holding in my laughter. Karen's face went scarlet as she scrambled to her feet, mud and leaves covering her expensive yoga pants. Her eyes burned with rage as she pointed at me with a shaking, dirt-covered hand. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I'm calling the authorities." And with that, she stormed off, marching toward her house like a general retreating after a failed invasion. I sighed, glancing back at the destruction. The once pristine garden was now a wasteland of chewed leaves, broken stems, and trampled flower beds. The goats, they stood around, completely unbothered, their bellies full and happy. I sighed, stretching my arms behind my head. This was going to be fun. The HOA, the cops, and the battle for my land. The morning after Karen's dramatic meltdown, I woke up with a sense of uneasy amusement. I had no doubt that she was already plotting her revenge, probably scribbling furiously in a notebook about all the ways she could make my life miserable. I wasn't particularly worried. I had legal ownership of my land, and no amount of HOA nonsense could change that. But dealing with self-entitled lunatics like Karen wasn't about logic. It was about who could play the long game better. I grabbed a cup of coffee and stepped out onto my porch, taking in the glorious aftermath of yesterday's events. My goats were lounging peacefully inside their pasture now, their bellies still full from their botanical feast. The remains of Karen's so-called garden were still scattered across my property. Trampled tulips, broken shrubs, and the overturned fountain that once stood proudly in what was now a goat-claimed wasteland. But my amusement was cut short when I noticed something new. A car was parked in front of my house. Not just any car, but a patrol vehicle. 2 uniformed police officers were standing in my driveway, one leaning against the hood with a bored expression, while the other looked through a small notepad. And standing between them, still covered in dirt from her humiliating fall yesterday, was Karen. She looked smug, arms crossed, her nose tilted so high in the air she could probably sniff the ozone layer. Oh, this was going to be good. Karen's pathetic attempt at playing the victim. As I approached, the officer with the notepad cleared his throat and gave me a tired look. He was the kind of cop who had seen it all, probably spent years breaking up bar fights and dealing with over-dramatic homeowners like Karen. "Morning, sir," he said in a professional yet bored tone, as if he already knew this was a waste of time. We received a report about an incident involving your livestock and the destruction of private property. Karen practically puffed up at that, her chest rising with satisfaction, as if she had just won the first battle in a grand legal war. I folded my arms. Oh, really? And whose property was supposedly destroyed? Karen's smug smile widened. Mine, she declared. He let his wild, uncontrolled animals loose in my garden. They destroyed my plants, my fountain, my entire landscaping project. I demand that he pay for the damages. The officer didn't even flinch at her theatrical delivery. He simply flipped a page in his notebook and turned to me. Sir, do you own livestock? I nodded. Yeah, I have goats. They usually stay inside their designated pasture until someone tore down my fence and gave them free access to what they probably thought was an all-you-can-eat buffet. Karen's fake confidence flickered for just a moment. That's not true, she shrieked. That fence was misplaced. It was encroaching on HOA property, so I had it removed to fix the boundaries. I raised an eyebrow. You fixed the boundaries, huh? Without a survey, without approval, without so much as a warning to the actual owner of the land. The officers exchanged glances. The one with the notepad sighed, looking visibly exhausted. Ma'am, he said, turning to Karen, did you obtain a legal property assessment before removing the fence? Karen's face went pale, but she doubled down like all entitled people do when they realize they're losing. I didn't need one. The HOA has every right to regulate land usage in this neighborhood. The fence was a violation of community aesthetic standards. He was hoarding valuable space that could be better used for the neighborhood. I let out a low chuckle. So let me get this straight. You're claiming that my privately owned land, which I've maintained for years, is now suddenly a community resource because you personally don't like how it looks. Karen scowled at me. You're being selfish. The officer massaged his temple like he was developing a migraine. Ma'am, if the fence was removed without legal authorization and the property belongs to him, then technically you're the one who committed property destruction, not him. Karen's eyes bulged. What? That's ridiculous. The officer ignored her and turned back to me. Would you like to press charges for trespassing and property damage? Oh, the look on Karen's face at that moment was priceless. Her mouth opened and closed, as if her brain had short-circuited. She had expected me to get arrested. She had thought she would win instantly, that the mere presence of cops would make me roll over and beg for mercy. And now, the tables had turned. I pretended to think about it for a moment, rubbing my chin dramatically. I could, but honestly, I think her destroyed garden is punishment enough. Karen gasped. You can't be serious. He should be paying me. He should be punished. You have to do something. The officer shrugged. We don't handle HOA disputes, ma'am. That's a civil matter. And as far as I can tell, you're the one who illegally altered someone else's property. If anything, we should be citing you. Karen's entire body trembled. I'll sue him, she suddenly shrieked. I'll take him to court for destruction of property. I'll take this to the neighborhood board. The officer sighed, closed his notepad, and simply said, You do that, ma'am. Then he turned to me, gave me an understanding nod, and walked back toward the patrol car. His partner followed, looking equally fed up with life. Karen stood there, looking like a volcano about to erupt. This isn't over, she hissed under her breath. You'll regret this. I smirked, taking a slow sip of my coffee, looking forward to it. She stormed off, practically stomping her way back to her house. I watched her leave, shaking my head in amusement. I had dealt with entitled people before, but Karen was on a whole different level of delusional villainy. I should have known she wasn't going to take this loss gracefully. And I was right. Because the next day, the HOA sent me a formal complaint letter, one that claimed my property was neglected, unsightly, and in violation of neighborhood harmony. They were trying to bully me into submission. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The HOA's dirty tactics and my ruthless counterattack. The morning after Karen's humiliating defeat with the cops, I thought, foolishly, that maybe, just maybe, she had finally learned her lesson. Maybe she had gone home, stared at the wreckage of her stolen garden, and realized that messing with me was a terrible idea. Maybe she had taken a deep breath and decided to let it go, to move on with her life, and to, respect other people's property like a normal human being. I should have known better. When I checked my mailbox, I found a crisp white envelope waiting for me. The return address. The Homeowners Association. I groaned before I even opened it. The letter inside was printed on fancy, letter-headed paper, filled with legalistic nonsense and passive-aggressive HOA jargon. The basic message. Your property is out of compliance with neighborhood standards and must be brought up to code immediately. Failure to do so will result in escalating fines and potential legal action. I laughed out loud. This was Karen's new angle. The same HOA that had never bothered me before, because, I didn't live in their jurisdiction, was now suddenly concerned about the state of my property, right after their queen bee got humiliated. What an interesting coincidence. Oh, but it got better. The letter detailed every so-called violation. Neglected landscaping. My overgrown land was an eyesore to the community. You mean the land that Karen's goats, I mean my goats, recently chewed down to dirt. That land. Excessive animal presence, my unregulated livestock, was a nuisance to the peace and aesthetic of the neighborhood. So my goats, which had lived here long before Karen even moved in, were now suddenly a problem. Noise complaints. The frequent and disruptive sounds coming from my property were allegedly disturbing the quiet suburban atmosphere. Unless occasional goat bleats counted as disturbance, this was pure nonsense. At the bottom of the letter, there was a fine schedule. If I didn't comply within 2 weeks, I'd start racking up daily fees. And if I failed to address these issues, the HOA would take legal action to bring my property into compliance. I almost wanted to frame the letter just for the sheer audacity. My first counterattack, exposing their lies. I knew exactly what was happening. Karen had run crying to the HOA board, playing the victim, and convinced them to weaponize their rules against me. She had failed with the police, so now she was trying bureaucracy warfare. Too bad for her. I knew how to fight dirty too. First, I did some digging. The HOA had no authority over my property. I had checked this years ago when I bought the land. My house sat just outside the HOA's legally defined borders. Sure, my property bordered their community, but they had no legal jurisdiction over me. I wasn't one of their members. I had never signed any of their contracts. I owed them nothing. I dug up my property deed and boundary maps, proof that my land was separate from the HOA's control. Then I made copies of everything. Next, I went around the neighborhood. I started talking to some of the other homeowners, people who actually were under the HOA's control. Turns out, Karen wasn't exactly well-liked. She's always stirring up problems, one woman muttered, rolling her eyes. Last year, she tried to get my kid's swing set removed because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. She's power-hungry, another man told me. Ever since she got on the board, she's been pushing stricter rules. She even fined me for having my Christmas lights up past January 2nd. Oh, this was gold. Not only had Karen lied to the HOA about my property belonging to them, but she was already on thin ice with her own neighbors. I now had 2 weapons, legal proof that the HOA had no authority over me, and a list of angry residents who were sick of Karen's antics. Time to go on the offensive. Karen's second meltdown, the HOA meeting. The next HOA board meeting was held at the local community center. I decided to attend uninvited. Oh, and I didn't come alone. I brought every piece of evidence I had, my property deed, boundary maps, printed copies of emails, and even statements from her own neighbors who were tired of her nonsense. When I walked in, Karen's face went white. She clearly hadn't expected me to show up. The board president, an older man named Frank, gave me a puzzled look. "Sir, this is an HOA board meeting for community members only." I smiled and set my stack of documents on the table. "Oh, don't worry. I won't take up too much of your time. I just came to clear up a little misunderstanding. Seems you guys think you have authority over my land." Karen immediately cut in. "He does live in our community. His property is literally right next to mine, and it's bringing down our neighborhood's value. We have every right to enforce standards." I chuckled and held up my property deed. "Actually, Karen, you don't. See this. My land is outside HOA jurisdiction. You have zero legal authority over my property. And since I never signed any agreement with your little association, you can take your fines and shove them." Frank took the papers and looked through them, frowning. "Karen, did you verify this before sending the complaint?" Karen's eye twitched. It's right next to our neighborhood. He's still part of the community." One of the residents scoffed. "You knew his house wasn't under HOA control, didn't you? You just wanted to harass him." Murmurs spread across the room. Several people were glaring at Karen now, and I could see her sweating bullets. Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "Karen, we cannot find someone who isn't a member. This is a legal liability waiting to happen. Consider the complaints dropped." Karen gasped. "You're just going to let him win? After what his filthy animals did to my garden?" Frank turned to her with a cold stare. "You tore down his fence without authorization. If anything, he could be suing you for trespassing and property damage." The room fell silent. Karen looked like she was about to explode, her face turning an unnatural shade of red. I leaned forward with a grin. "But don't worry, Karen. I'm feeling generous. I won't sue you for damages. I'll just enjoy watching you dig your own grave." She let out a frustrated screech, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the meeting. And just like that, the HOA battle was over. The final blow, Karen's fall from power. A few weeks later, I found out through the grapevine that Karen had been voted off the HOA board. Apparently, after the meeting, more homeowners had come forward about her petty rule enforcement and abuse of power. The final straw. She had tried to fine an elderly couple for having their flower pots too close to the sidewalk. With no allies left, she had been forced to resign. And as for me, I built a brand new fence, taller and stronger than ever. This time, with security cameras aimed right at Karen's house, just in case she ever got any more bright ideas. And my goats. They lived happily ever after. Karen's revenge and my ruthless checkmate. I would love to say that after Karen got kicked off the HOA board, she learned her lesson, took up a new hobby like knitting or birdwatching, and finally let me live in peace. But people like Karen don't let things go. Oh no, when people like her lose, they don't reflect on their mistakes. They don't take responsibility. And they certainly don't just move on. Instead, they plot revenge. And boy, did Karen try. After her humiliating defeat at the HOA meeting, things went eerily quiet for a few weeks. I didn't see her outside much. And for once, I was able to enjoy my morning coffee without worrying about some ridiculous HOA complaint or another police visit. But then, strange things started happening. It started small, annoying, but not immediately suspicious. My mailbox was suddenly stuffed with junk mail, way more than usual. Flyers for everything from pest control services to church bake sales to offers to buy my house for cash piled up inside. At first, I chalked it up to bad luck, until I found a flyer addressed to Karen Thompson in the stack. Coincidence? Maybe. Then came the fake service calls. One morning, I opened my door to find a plumber standing on my porch, holding a clipboard and looking confused. "I'm here for the emergency pipe repair," he said. I frowned. I didn't call for any repairs. He checked his work order. "This is 117 Oakwood Drive, right?" "Yeah, that's me, but there's no plumbing issue." The guy scratched his head. Huh, that's weird. I got a call from a Mr. Thompson about a major leak. He even prepaid for the inspection fee. That's when I knew. Karen was behind this. She was trying to harass me through petty inconveniences, and she wasn't even being subtle about it. I tried to brush it off, but the fake service calls kept coming. An exterminator showed up one afternoon saying I had booked a termite inspection. A lawn care company called to confirm my request for a full resodding of my yard. Then came the worst one. A tow truck driver pounding on my door at 6 a.m., saying he was there to tow my broken-down vehicle. By the fourth or fifth time, I stopped being annoyed and started being impressed. It was almost pathetic how much effort she was putting into this. But if Karen thought she could wear me down with petty harassment, she was in for a rude awakening. Because if she wanted to play dirty, I was about to bury her in the mud. My counterattack, exposing Karen's schemes. The first thing I did was set up security cameras. I had already installed a few after the fence incident, but now I went all out. Motion-activated floodlights, high-definition surveillance cameras, and even a Ring doorbell system. Within days, I caught Karen red-handed. Late one night, a grainy figure appeared on my camera footage, slipping out of her house and heading toward my mailbox. She was stuffing flyers and junk mail inside like some kind of deranged paperboy. I grinned. Oh, but it got better. A few nights later, I caught her standing at the edge of my driveway, talking to a tow truck driver. My camera's microphone barely picked it up, but I could hear her trying to convince him that my truck was abandoned and needed to be impounded. She was desperate, and I had all the proof I needed. Phase 2, the ultimate payback. I could have gone to the police, but I wanted to drag this out. Karen had spent so much time trying to wear me down, and now it was my turn to watch her squirm. I started by sending copies of the security footage to the local service companies. I made sure they knew that any future calls for my address had to be verified in person, because a certain someone was wasting their time. Next, I dropped a casual email to the HOA board president, Frank, letting him know that his former board member was actively harassing me. Frank, to his credit, was horrified. Apparently, after Karen was kicked off the board, she had been begging for reinstatement, claiming that she had been unfairly removed by hostile forces in the community. When I sent him the footage, he laughed out loud. "She's never getting back on the board," he told me. But the real checkmate was the junk mail revenge. Since Karen loved stuffing my mailbox, I decided to return the favor. Using her full name and address, I signed her up for every single junk mail list I could find. Free catalogs. Signed up. Magazine subscriptions. Check. Political campaign flyers from every party imaginable. Oh, absolutely. Exclusive winning sweepstakes entries. You bet. Religious pamphlets, credit card offers, and charity donation requests. All of it. I even found a request-free home service estimates website that let you schedule door-to-door sales visits. Within a week, Karen's mailbox was overflowing. Her front door, constantly visited by salesmen and canvassers. And the best part, she couldn't complain to anyone. If she tried to report the mail harassment, she'd have to admit that she'd been doing the same thing to me. Within 2 weeks, she looked exhausted. I saw her standing at her mailbox one morning, staring at the massive pile of junk spilling out. Her hands were shaking. She looked like a woman on the verge of a breakdown. She stormed back into her house and slammed the door so hard I heard it from my porch. The final nail in the coffin. By this point, Karen was done. The fake service calls stopped. The tow truck incidents disappeared. No more mailbox stuffing, no more harassment, no more petty games. I had won. But there was one last cherry on top. A few months later, a for sale sign appeared in front of Karen's house. Word spread through the neighborhood that she was moving away. Apparently, between her public humiliation, her failed harassment attempts, and the fact that most of the neighborhood hated her guts, she had decided that a fresh start somewhere else was her only option. And when I saw the moving truck pull into her driveway, I just sat on my porch, sipping my coffee and waved. She didn't wave back. The moral of the story: if you steal someone's land, call the cops on them, weaponize the HOA, and try to ruin their life, you'd better be prepared for them to hit back twice as hard. Karen thought she could bully me into submission. Instead, she lost her power, her reputation, and eventually her home. And me. I got to enjoy my land, my goats, and my peace and quiet. The return of the Queen of Chaos. If I had thought Karen's final retreat was the end of it, I was mistaken. When she sold her house and moved away, I had a good 6 months of absolute peace. My land was mine again, my goats were happy and fat, and the neighborhood had never been quieter. Without her constant meddling, the HOA actually relaxed their ridiculous restrictions, and the community started to breathe again. But like some horrible sequel no one asked for, Karen returned. And she returned with a vengeance. It started with a single car, an unfamiliar SUV slowly rolling down my street, passing my property multiple times. I noticed it, of course. I may have been relaxing, but I wasn't stupid. The vehicle was too new, too clean, and it spent way too much time idling near my driveway. At first, I assumed it was a lost realtor or someone checking out the area. But when I saw a familiar blonde head behind the wheel, my blood ran cold. Karen. She was back. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching her. She didn't stop, didn't roll down the window, just kept driving back and forth, like a shark circling prey. Then, just as quickly as she had come, she sped off. Something wasn't right. And I was about to find out just how much worse things were about to get. A new home, a new scheme. After some digging, I found out where she had moved. She hadn't gone far, just a few streets over, on the opposite side of the HOA's jurisdiction. She was close enough to meddle, but far enough to avoid direct retaliation, because she had found a loophole. Karen was no longer bound by the HOA's rules, meaning she could act without their restrictions. She was free to pull every underhanded trick in the book, and the HOA, who now wanted nothing to do with her, wouldn't lift a finger to stop her. I should have seen it coming, but I had no idea just how far she was willing to go. The mysterious complaints begin. A week after her reappearance, I received a visit from Animal Control. The officer, a no-nonsense woman with a clipboard and a tired expression, stepped out of her truck and looked around my property. "We got an anonymous complaint about animal neglect," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Really? From who?" She shrugged, flipping through her notes. "Can't say. We just have to follow up on reports." I gestured to my goats, who were lounging in the sun, fat, happy, and clearly not neglected. My barn was clean, my water troughs were full, and my feed supply was stacked neatly nearby. I had every legal permit for livestock ownership, and my goats were healthier than most people's house pets. The officer sighed, checked a few boxes on her clipboard, and said, "This is the third false report I've had this week. Looks like someone has a vendetta." I crossed my arms. "Let me guess. Blonde woman, crazy eyes, massive grudge." She snorted. "You'd be surprised how often that's the case." After a brief inspection, she closed the case immediately, but the damage was done. Karen was back to her old tricks, using bureaucracy as a weapon. And this was just the beginning. The attack escalates. Over the next month, I was bombarded with everything Karen could throw at me. A health inspector showed up, claiming my property was a potential biohazard site. He left after realizing it was just a normal farm. Fake noise complaints flooded the local authorities, accusing me of running an illegal business. I wasn't. My power company received a request to disconnect my electricity. Someone had pretended to be me and filed a shoot-off notice. Thankfully, I caught it in time. Mysterious nails appeared in my driveway, conveniently placed right where my truck's tires would hit them. This woman was obsessed. She wasn't just trying to annoy me. She was actively trying to ruin my life. And I was done playing defense. The final battle. Baiting the trap. I had been patient. I had tolerated her nonsense for too long. It was time to go on the offensive. I started by installing more cameras, this time hidden ones along my property line. If Karen was personally involved in the harassment, I was going to catch her in the act. Then I set up a decoy. I placed a stack of new fence materials near the edge of my property, right where Karen could see them. The pile was just sitting there, unguarded, practically begging to be tampered with. And sure enough, 3 nights later, I caught her sneaking onto my land. The footage was gold. Karen, dressed in all black like a cartoon burglar, creeping onto my property with a bucket of paint. She started splashing bright red letters across my fence, writing "illegal live stalking" in massive letters. The cameras caught every second of it. And the best part, I had already called the police before she even started. The officers arrived mid-crime, catching her red-handed, literally, since she still had paint-covered hands when they confronted her. The look on her face when she saw the flashing lights. Priceless. She screeched. She tried to run. She tried to blame me. But the footage was undeniable. She was arrested on the spot for trespassing, vandalism, and harassment. The aftermath. The end of Karen. The fallout was spectacular. Karen was fined heavily, forced to pay for damages, and given a restraining order preventing her from coming within 500 feet of my property. The community, already sick of her nonsense, celebrated her downfall. And just like that, the Queen of Chaos was finally dethroned. A month later, another for sale sign appeared, this time in front of her new house. She was gone for good. And me. I rebuilt my fence, put up bigger signs, and installed even more security cameras, just in case some new idiot got any ideas. But nothing happened, because for the first time in years, Karen was truly, finally, out of my life. And my goats, well, they celebrated the only way they knew how, by chewing on the one remaining piece of Karen's garden that had survived all this time. It was the perfect ending. Moral of the story: if you mess with someone's land, their livelihood, and their patience, you'd better be prepared for the consequences. Because sometimes the villain of the story doesn't win. Sometimes the goats do. The aftermath and the legacy of the goats. With Karen finally gone, life returned to normal. No more fake complaints, no more random inspectors showing up at my door, no more shady attempts at sabotaging my property. It was as if a storm had finally passed, leaving behind nothing but peace and quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could actually enjoy my morning coffee without expecting some ridiculous HOA fine, police visit, or goat-related crisis. My land was mine again, truly and completely, and I was ready to move forward. But as I quickly learned, Karen's departure didn't erase her legacy of chaos. It only changed it. Because while she was gone, the stories about her lived on. And in an unexpected twist, my goats, those innocent little creatures who had unknowingly waged war against Karen's garden, became local legends. The goats of justice. A neighborhood revolution. It all started with a neighbor's kid. One day, as I was at the local farmer's market picking up supplies, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed at me. "Mom, it's the goat guy," he whispered, eyes wide with admiration. I blinked. The what now? His mother smiled knowingly and leaned in. "My son loves the story of how your goats took down Karen's garden. He calls them the goats of justice." I laughed, thinking she was joking. That's a new one. But the more I talked to people, the more I realized something bizarre had happened. Apparently, after Karen's meltdown, downfall, and exile, the neighborhood had turned the whole ordeal into a legendary cautionary tale. My goats were no longer just livestock. They were now symbols of defiance. People had started spreading the story. The older residents told it like a mythological battle, where Karen, the evil HOA queen, had been defeated by the forces of nature itself. The kids turned it into a tall tale, complete with magical goats who only targeted people with bad energy. The local teens made memes about it, editing photos of my goats with laser eyes and dramatic captions like the HOA Slayer and Guardian of Property Rights. Someone even printed t-shirts that said, "Don't mess with the goats." I was half amused, half bewildered. I never set out to become some kind of folk hero. All I had wanted was to keep my land and mind my own business. But somehow, my goats had become community icons, and their little rebellion had sparked something bigger. The HOA, once an iron-fisted dictatorship, was now struggling to keep control. The HOA's sudden decline. With Karen out of the picture, the HOA started to fall apart. Her absence left a power vacuum, and since she had been the most vocal and aggressive enforcer of ridiculous rules, no one wanted to step up to replace her. The fines dropped. The insane landscaping rules relaxed. The petty complaints stopped. Without Karen micromanaging everything, the neighborhood started to change. People planted what they wanted, painted their homes whatever color they liked, and most shockingly, some even stopped mowing their lawns on a strict schedule, a true act of rebellion. The fear that had once ruled the community was gone. And the best part, a few months after her departure, a new HOA president was elected, a quiet, reasonable man named Jim, who had lived in the neighborhood for years, but had never been involved in the politics of it. Jim's first order of business: "I think we should let people live their lives in peace and stop wasting time on dumb rules." The vote was unanimous. And just like that, the HOA dictatorship officially ended. Karen's last, pitiful attempt at revenge. Now, I wish I could say Karen disappeared forever, never to be heard from again. But life isn't that generous. One final chapter of the saga played out 6 months later, when I received a letter in the mail from Karen. I sighed, already exhausted before even opening it. The letter was pathetically desperate. A long-winded rant about how she had been wronged, how I had ruined her reputation, and how she still believed that I was hoarding land that could have been beautified for the community. Yes, she was still on that argument. Then came the threat: "If you don't apologize and publicly acknowledge how you've damaged my life, I will be forced to take legal action." I read it twice, then laughed so hard I almost spilled my coffee. Legal action? For what exactly? For owning my own land? For surviving her harassment? She had no case, and she knew it. So I did what any rational person would do. I crumpled up the letter, tossed it in the recycling bin, and never responded. That was the last I ever heard from Karen. The happily ever after, for me, not her. From that moment on, life was peaceful. The HOA minded its own business. My goats continued living their best lives. And my land remained exactly as it should be, mine. As for Karen, well, last I heard, she moved 3 states away. Rumor had it she tried to join another HOA and immediately started causing drama, only to get banned from the board before she could seize control. Some people never learn. But me, I had my land, my peace, and my goats. And every once in a while, when a new neighbor moved in and asked about the old HOA battles, I'd just point to my goats and say, "You ever hear about the time a bunch of farm animals took down a tyrant?" And then I'd sit back and watch as they heard the legend of the goats of justice for the very first time.